Hey guys, good morning. It's Dr. Ken Norbert here to talk to you about whitetails and whitetail hunting again. Today I'm going to talk about phase 2 of the Whitetail Rut. Phase 2 of the Whitetail Rut is the most dynamic of the rut phases and the least understood. It's a big subject. I have to divide this subject into 3 parts. This is the first part of phase 2 of the Whitetail Rut. And in case you haven't seen me talk about the whitetail rut before, let me explain a few things. In 1988, I was the first person to publish articles that accurately explain the whitetail rut. And I wrote a book, published that soon after, and that sort of became the whitetail hunter's Bible for quite a long time. If you didn't see that first introduction, well, let me tell you about it, the whitetail rut, and that kind of surprise you. Bucks, antlered bucks, are involved with some activities that have something to do with the breeding among whitetails over a period of 4.5 months. Maybe you thought the whitetail rut was just a 2-week period sometime in the fall when whitetails breed. What most hunters don't realize is that whitetail does actually breed during 3 separate periods, 2-week periods. The first one in November, the next one in early November, the next one early December, and the last one in the last days of December and early January. Well, one of the things about the rut too is a lot of people believe that whitetails, the does breed while bucks are making antler rubs and ground scrapes. And if you saw the first this series of talks about the whitetail rut, that just isn't true. That they breed when bucks are making antler rubs and ground scrapes. Most of their antler rubs and ground scrape, 90% of them are made during the last 2 weeks of October and the first few days of November each year, all over America. But breeding doesn't take place then. And it can be easily proven. 85% of fawns are born in May. And the other 15% are born after that, some in June and some in July. And the period of pregnancy in a doe is 7 months. Now, if they were bred in October, we'd have fawns being born in March, which just doesn't happen, or even April, which doesn't happen. They start being born in May. Breeding doesn't take place for the first time until early November. Now, the first part of the whitetail rut is a period during which bucks decide who amongst them are going to do all of the breeding within their individual square miles in which they live. Which one is going to become more dominant? It's the period during which they establish a pecking order of all the bucks living in each square mile of whitetail habitat all across America. The one that loses battles with all the other bucks is the least dominant, and he's subservient to all the other bucks living in his square mile for a year. The one who wins all the battles becomes the dominant breeding buck of the area, and he does all or most all of the breeding that occurs amongst does throughout the periods that they're in estrus, ready to breed. Well, this is established, happens during the 2 to 3 weeks period before breeding begins. And this is what I'm talking about today, phase 2 of the whitetail rut, which will be full of surprises as well. Now, by this time, phase 2 usually begins here in Minnesota, and it can be later as you go further south in America. But it usually begins during the middle of October, 2 to 3 weeks before breeding begins in early November. It's a time when all our maple trees are red and we're starting to get frost at night. Now, all of the phases of the whitetail rut are triggered by certain ratios of darkness to sunlight, except phase 2. Generally, it begins about the middle of October here in Minnesota when we start getting freezing temperatures at night, frost at night. And it doesn't happen till then because by the middle of October, all our bucks and other deer already have grown their winter fur. Their thin and wiry red fur of summer has been replaced by thicker and more cottony type underfur by mid-October. And if the temperature is much above 32 degrees here in Minnesota, it's just kind of uncomfortable for bucks with this heavy fur. It'd be like you and I wearing goose down underwear out there, and at that time of year, we wouldn't care to do much either. But normally, once we start getting these freezing temperatures at night, every antlered buck in the woods, including yearlings, begins to make antler rubs and ground scrapes. And they make them to delineate, to tell all other bucks where they intend to breed does. They all want to establish breeding ranges within their home ranges. I guess it's probably an instinctive thing, a genetic thing that makes them start doing that when the temperature gets down low enough. By the way, you know, it doesn't have to be 32 degrees in South Carolina for them to start making antler rubs and ground scrapes. Down there it only takes 60 degrees at night, but they don't develop winter coats like our northern Minnesota whitetails. Up here in Minnesota, whitetails grow a lot thicker and warmer coats for the winter because they have to live through winters where the temperature drops as low as 45 degrees below zero. Now, anyway, at this period, all of a sudden it's like a circus out there in the woods. All these bucks making antler rubs and ground scrapes to mark their intended breeding ranges. In other words, antler rubs and ground scrapes are signs of, you know, they're kind of like no trespassing signs made by bucks to tell other bucks, this is my breeding range and you guys should stay out of here. Well, it doesn't work for all the bucks because only the dominant breeding buck decides whether or not, well, they decide all you other bucks have got to get out of here when does are in estrus. You know, I'm the big boss here now, and you guys are all subservient to me. And when I put an antler rub or ground scrape in my breeding range, which encompasses an area at least a square mile in size, maybe 2 square miles in some cases, those markers are intended to intimidate and tell those other bucks, you guys stay out of here, this is mine. Well, in the beginning has to make sure that happens. And when we get to the period where they start making all of these breeding range signs, about 90% of them are made during this period, that buck will travel throughout its range repeatedly, day after day, especially during periods when most whitetails are feeding, looking for these other bucks. And when he finds them, you know, they're fearful of this buck now because they've been thoroughly beaten by him during their battles. He'll chase them out of there. He'll run them out of the range. Now, some of the older bucks, they've been through this several times already, so they're used to what's going on here. And most of the older bucks, once they're chased off range, they'll find little secluded areas off range where they'll stay. Well, they'll remain and they'll bed and sleep and water in that little area until breeding is over. And they know what the program is. Yearling bucks, this is a first time thing for them. And what makes it a little tough for big dominant breeding bucks is that yearling bucks, every time they're threatened by something dangerous, they want to run to their mother, who they still depend on for direction and leadership in times of danger. So a big dominant buck might have to chase a yearling buck out of his square mile range, which is now becoming his breeding range, several times. So it forces these bucks to spend a good deal of time searching for these other bucks. Meanwhile, making and renewing ground scrapes and antler rubs. So let's talk about those particular signs. You know, when a buck makes an antler rub, he'll rub the tree until he's down to the bare wood underneath the bark, which makes it quite visible for long distances. And then to make sure that other bucks don't miss seeing them and understanding what this means, they'll rub scalp scent on it. Now, scalp scent comes from a number of small glands in the hide of a buck between its antlers. And these little glands, they're like sebaceous glands in humans that we have under our hair and the backs of our neck. They'll start producing a strong musk odor. That's part of one of the new things happens, a musk odor that's carried in a viscous fluid from these glands down under the sides of their heads and back onto the sides of their neck. And so after a buck creates an antler rub, he'll rub that scalp scent on that rub. And that way, if a buck comes from another direction and he doesn't readily spot that antler rub, he'll smell it. And he'll when he gets close to the thing, he'll check that out more carefully because of the smell. Because the big dominant buck creates more of this odor than any of the other bucks. And then you'll see the large area that's where the bark has been removed, and he knows that I'm now in the range of that big dominant buck, and if he catches me here, I'm in trouble. He'll either fight with me and maybe injure me, and so I better get out of here. And like I said, the yearling bucks don't always understand that, but all of them, even yearling bucks, will make antler rubs on trees. Now, one of the interesting things about antler rubs is that they generally reflect the size of the buck. And there's a reason for that. When a buck starts making an antler rub at this time of the year, the process becomes kind of a battle, like when fighting with other bucks. When you fight with a buck, what they do is engage their antlers and push against one another with all their might until one of them has to give ground, either because his neck has been twisted by the bigger buck and it's starting to hurt, or it's been turned to one side and they have to give ground. And when they have to give significant ground and usually jump away for fear of being injured, that buck becomes the loser. So when they fight a tree, they act as if after a bit that they're actually fighting another buck, and some of them will grunt like a bear, and they'll really carry on with that tree, and at the same time they're making this antler rub that's very important to them, and so they don't want to break the tree, they don't want to push it down to the ground, but they want to feel some give while they're doing this fighting. And if it gives, well, then they're winning, you see. So a 140, 150 pound yearling buck in Minnesota, northern Minnesota, will generally take on a tree about 1 inch in diameter, 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch in diameter. An older buck, a 2.5-year-old, which will weigh up around 175 pounds live, will take on a tree 2 to 2.5 inches in diameter. And older bucks, the 3.5 to 6.5-year-olds, and few live longer, and those are bigger bucks, weighing up to 195 to 300 pounds in northern Minnesota. They'll take on trees that are 3 to 4 inches in diameter, and sometimes a lot larger. 6 inches is not uncommon, and we've found antler rubs made by big bucks and trees as large as 10 inches in diameter. So, but they can take on much heavier trees because of their added weight, and they tend to be a little more aggressive because by this time testosterone in their bloodstream, the male sex hormone, is starting to peak, and when it peaks they become much more aggressive toward one another. So anyway, the size of the antler rub not only tells other bucks about the size of the bucks that made them, but tells us hunters as well.